Okay, so we're going to do this again. I do have the microphone on this time. This is the Beretta PM-12 fire control group and what everything is, how it works, how it's set up. This would be installed in the gun with basically at the rest position. We have our bolt block, trigger spring, trigger pin, grip safety pin, selector switch, sear pin, a sear limiter pin, grip safety trigger or grip safety button, and the sear spring here. Right now you can see that the sear will not move because the grip safety is in the way. So if you tried to pull the trigger, the sear would not pivot up because it hits the grip safety here. I'm going to go ahead and remove the trigger spring here because we don't need it for functionality testing. I'm going to remove the selector because it doesn't need to be in there. You can see that the trigger itself rides on the selector. When I build these as a semi-auto, I weld in the groove right here and then cut this so that it is D-shaped so that a regular selector will not go into the receiver. I then D-shape this hole here. I'm going to go ahead and remove the bolt block. So the way this works, the grip safety needs to be pushed so that this part of the grip safety can go into this channel. That's what keeps this from being pressed when you don't want it pressed. This pin here is very important. Don't think you don't need it. Without this pin in there, your sear will over travel and cause you all kinds of issues. So I'm going to go ahead and move the sear spring back this way so I have a little more movement. You can see where the trigger rides on the sear. This spring should actually be in here, but for sake of being able to move everything around without the other half of the receiver, we're going to move it out of the way. So your trigger will not move right now because the sear hits the block. When you grab the grip safety goes up here, which allows the sear to move down in here when the trigger is pressed. When the trigger is pressed, it pushes up on the sear. The sear drops down in here, releases the bolt. Now, the way this all works is the distance here is very critical. This will drop off, the sear will rise back up, and then when you release the trigger will come down, the trigger spring will push the trigger back out to reset it under the sear. That's what that is all about. It's because when you have the selector in here, the selector limits how far the trigger itself will travel. When that groove is there, what it actually does, instead of sitting on the trigger, on the sear this way, so that when you squeeze the trigger, it falls off the sear. When you go to full auto and it sits in that groove, when you squeeze the trigger stays right there. It doesn't fall off the sear. So if you get the distance wrong between these pinholes and this pinhole when you're welding together, this will either release too soon, not allowing the sear to come down far enough to release the bolt, or it will never fall off and it will hold the sear down the entire time you're holding the trigger. That can be changed by changing a little bit of distance here where it rides against the selector, and changing distances on this leading edge and this leading edge to get the proper clearance, rather than cutting the receiver back apart and trying to move everything and re-weld it. Leave the receiver the way it is. Mess with these two pieces in your selector to get your proper function out of it. I can also tell you that if you look at the sear really close, it's slightly canted on this front edge, and it's got a sharp corner here. I've had some that when you release the trigger, the trigger will come back to here, and unless you physically grab the trigger like this and pull it forward, it will not drop underneath here. If you take a small file and just round this corner ever so slightly, the trigger will get rid of that problem. The trigger will reset on its own. But that is how this all gets put together, how it works, and how to take care of your problems here if you get your spacing wrong on your pinholes. Like I said, if it's not releasing soon enough and it's acting like it's full auto, so it's keeping the sear down while you're holding the trigger, then what's happening is your trigger is never falling off the sear. So you need to shorten your sear a little bit on this leading edge so that when you squeeze the trigger, it does drop off the front like that. If it drops off too soon, you need to lengthen the sear on this leading edge so that it takes just a little bit longer before it drops off the front, because that will control just exactly how far down. The dropping off the front of that sear will control how far the sear moves before it releases the bolt and before the trigger drops off. You can use this distance right here to fix any distance problem you encounter between these two pinholes if you have the receiver that's cut between the holes. And that's pretty much how this whole system works.